My father didn't stand up when I walked into the dining room. Neither did Giselle. I'd flown 11 hours from a military hospital in Landstuhl to LaGuardia, then endured a town car ride up to our family's glass atrium penthouse on Park Crescent, my left shoulder still stiff under 3 layers of gauze nobody in this house would think to ask about. The shrapnel had come out of a stairwell in a Geneva diplomatic annex 4 months earlier, during an operation I still wasn't cleared to describe to anyone outside a secure facility. I remember standing in the elevator on the way up, watching the floor numbers climb, and rehearsing, the way you rehearse a cover story before a debrief, a version of the last 4 months simple enough to survive dinner conversation. In the end, nobody asked, so the rehearsal was wasted. What I would have told them, if anyone had actually asked, wasn't dramatic. It never is, in the moment. There had been a stairwell, concrete and unlit, a source meeting that went sideways in the space of about 4 seconds. A device I still don't fully understand the mechanics of, and then a very long, very quiet stretch of time lying against cold stone, with my hand pressed hard against my own shoulder, listening to my own pulse and trying to remember the specific breathing pattern a combat medic had taught me 2 deployments earlier. I hadn't thought about my family in that stairwell. I'd thought about my mother's watch, oddly, still sitting in a drawer back in Virginia, and I'd made myself a quiet promise that if I made it out, I was going to stop letting people who'd never once bled for anything decide what my life was worth. I sat down at a table set with a 7-course tasting menu, prepared by a chef flown in from Lyon for the occasion, white linen so stiff it could have stood on its own, a centerpiece of imported peonies that must have cost more than my monthly housing allowance used to, back whence I still drew one. Nobody asked how I was healing. Nobody asked where I'd been. My father poured himself a second glass of a Bordeaux he'd been saving for a business dinner. He clearly considered more important than this one. And for a long moment the only sound in that vast glass-walled room was the scrape of silver against porcelain. "You've lost weight," he said finally, not glancing up from the wine list, as though my body had personally inconvenienced him by changing shape without his approval. Harrison Belmont built Belmont Maritime Holdings out of scrap capital and cold nerve back in the 80s, clawing a shipping empire together one hostile contract at a time, and by 62 he'd learned to measure every human being who crossed his threshold in net worth and headline value. I hadn't given him either in 14 years, not since I'd traded a finance internship at his company for a commission I never told him about, until the paperwork was already signed, and there was nothing left for him to talk me out of. 14 years in that uniform, Giselle said, swirling her wine like she'd practiced the gesture in a mirror. "And you still fly coach." She laughed like it was a joke we were both supposed to enjoy together, the way we used to laugh at things when we were children sharing a bedroom, instead of grown women sharing almost nothing at all. There had been a version of us once that I still thought about more than I ever admitted out loud. 10 and 7 years old, splitting a bunk bed in a house half this size in Alexandria, Giselle sneaking down to my bottom bunk during thunderstorms because our mother worked too many nights to be home for them. I used to hold her hand until she fell asleep and tell her the thunder was just the sky clearing its throat. Somewhere between that house and this penthouse, the sister who used to reach for my hand had learned that reaching for anything at all was a sign of weakness our father didn't reward, and she'd spent the 20 years since burying that girl under a wardrobe budget larger than most people's annual salary. My sister had turned 31 that April and looked, in the candlelight, unsettlingly like our mother used to look. If our mother had ever worn a Cartier diamond necklace worth $150,000 to a family dinner, nobody outside this apartment would ever see. Giselle hosted the Belmont Atelier, a high society talk show that had made her a minor celebrity among people who cared deeply about the difference between a Birkin and a Kelly bag, and she talked about my career the way other people talk about a relative's failed restaurant, with a kind of performed pity that let her feel generous while saying something cruel. A boring shelter, she called it once, months earlier over the phone, for people who can't survive the real world. My father had laughed at that one too, the way he laughed at most things, Giselle said. The specific laugh of a man reassuring himself he'd raised at least one daughter who understood what mattered. I didn't answer any of it that night. In counterintelligence, silence isn't emptiness. It's a collection tool. You let people talk long enough, and they hand you everything they actually believe, wrapped in whatever language they assume you're too slow or too polite to catch. I caught all of it that evening. The way my father's jaw tightened every time he said the word army, like it was a diagnosis instead of a career. The way Giselle's eyes flicked toward my left arm, Toward the tension, I was working very hard, not to show every time I reached for my water glass with a shoulder that still screamed if I moved it wrong. Then Giselle set down her fork with the particular precision of someone who'd rehearsed a moment in advance, waiting for the right silence to drop it into. "I want Mom's watch," she said. She meant the Patek Philippe. Our mother, Eleanor Belmont, had spent 19 years splitting her time between a cryptology desk at Fort Meade and a joint federal task force she never once fully explained to either of us. The kind of career that produced long absences, unexplained bruises she called a fall, and phone calls at strange hours that she always took in another room. The watch had been the one object she wore every single day of that working life, long after the rest of her wardrobe had gone quiet and practical. A small circle of golden enamel that survived 3 decades of a job that survived almost nothing else. When she died, cancer, 8 years ago, 6 months after I commissioned, she'd left it to me. Not to Giselle. Me. My sister had never quite forgiven the will for that. And I don't think she'd forgiven our mother for it either. Though our mother had been in the ground too long to argue the point. "You don't represent this family," Giselle said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse than if she'd shouted it. "You disappear for months at a time. You come back looking like you got hit by a bus. And you won't even tell us what you actually do over there. I'm the one people actually see. I'm on television 5 days a week. I should have something that means something, not you." I thought for a moment of the last time I'd seen my mother wind that watch by hand, sitting on the edge of my childhood bed the night before I left for basic training. She hadn't said much that night, which was its own kind of language between us. She'd taken it off her own wrist, held it out, then changed her mind and put it back on, telling me I'd earn my own someday, and hers would still be waiting when I did. I never told Giselle that story. I'm not sure, even now, that she would have wanted to hear it. I set my napkin down on the table, folded once, the way you fold a flag at the end of a funeral. "It's not available," I said. 4 words. I didn't raise my voice above the pitch I'd used to close out a routine briefing. My right hand rested flat against the cold marble tabletop, and underneath the calm, something in me had started counting. Not seconds, not minutes, but a slower kind of countdown. The kind that starts the moment you finally decide a line has been drawn and you're done pretending it hasn't. "It's a watch, Jacqueline," my father said, setting his glass down hard enough that the crystal rang. "Give it to your sister. She'll actually wear it in public." "What are you going to do with it?" "Take it back to whatever hole you crawl into for 6 months at a time." What none of them knew, what I hadn't told a single living person in that apartment, was that the watch wasn't only sentimental. My mother had paid an engraver in Alexandria to etch 6 words into the caseback the year before she died. Words I'd read maybe 400 times since. Words that had gotten me through a hospital bed in Landstuhl and would get me through whatever this family was about to become. I wasn't ready to say them out loud yet, not to people who'd never once earned the right to hear them. By the time this story is over, you'll understand exactly why she chose to leave it with me instead of my sister, and what it ended up costing all of us to find that out. Here's where I'll ask you something, because I already suspect you know which side of this you'd land on. Comment A if you'd have handed Giselle that watch just to buy yourself one peaceful dinner in a family that had never once given you peace to begin with. Comment B if you'd have done exactly what I did, and held on to every inch of what was actually yours, even knowing it would cost you the last illusion that this was still a family at all. I'll tell you which one I chose by the end of this story. My father cleared his throat like the whole exchange had personally inconvenienced his digestion. "This is exactly the problem with you," he said. "You come home from wherever it is you go, and you can't even give your own sister a watch. 14 years of this. 14 years of you being difficult about things that don't matter." Giselle didn't say anything more. She just picked her fork back up and resumed eating, the particular silence of someone who'd already decided the conversation wasn't over, only paused, the way a negotiator tables an offer rather than withdraws it. I recognized that silence. I'd used it myself, professionally, more times than I could count, and seeing it turned against me at my own family's dinner table landed with a specific cold clarity that told me this hadn't ended at all. It had only moved somewhere I couldn't see it coming from next. I stood up, thanked the chef quietly in the kitchen doorway for a meal I'd barely tasted, and left the penthouse before either of them could see that. My hands weren't entirely steady on the elevator call button, not from fear, from the particular exhaustion of loving people who had decided, a long time ago and without ever once discussing it with me, that quiet meant weak, and that weak meant something they were entitled to take. What I didn't know that night what I'd only reconstruct weeks later from bank records, server logs, and a federal case file with my own name typed into the witness field, was that 4 floors below my sister's dressing room at the Belmont Atelier. Her show was dying a slow, extremely expensive death, and had been for the better part of 2 quarters. The overnight ratings had been sliding since February. A French luxury conglomerate called Maison Solerne had been dangling a $42 million, 3-year national syndication deal in front of Giselle's producers. And that same week, the deal had stalled over a single line item in the contract negotiations. Maison Solerne's marketing division wanted, in their words, authentic emotional content. Something with real stakes, something built to trend, something that would make a mid-tier lifestyle program feel indispensable again. Alistair Kingsgrave, my sister's husband, ran a private equity and offshore advisory practice called Kingsgrave Meridian Capital out of a glass office on West 57th Street, and he had spent that same week on the phone with a man he only ever referred to, even in his own private notes, by a single first initial, discussing a wire transfer routed through a Cayman Island shell company called Corvexa Trading Limited. He was 36, handsome in the specific, practiced way that made people trust him before he'd said a single true thing to them, and he had built his entire adult life on the assumption that no one in his wife's family would ever look closely enough to notice what he actually did for a living, hidden behind spreadsheets full of numbers that all technically added up. He'd married into this family 6 years earlier at a wedding I attended in dress uniform between deployments, and I remember standing at the edge of that reception, watching him work the room of shipping executives and old money guests with an ease that struck me, even then, as slightly too polished for a man who claimed to have built his fortune from nothing in Connecticut. My mother had still been alive for that wedding, though barely, already thin from the treatments she never once complained about in front of us. She'd pulled me aside near the bar, watching Alistair charm a table of Harrison's business partners, and said only, "I don't trust a man who never once asks a question he doesn't already know the answer to." I hadn't understood what she meant until years later, sitting in a dressing room reading wire transfer records with her watch still on my wrist. That same week, while I sat alone in my old bedroom, icing a shoulder that would never fully heal, Alistair mentioned something to Giselle over a late dinner that would end up mattering, more than either of them understood at the time. He'd pulled my military pension records through a contact at a background verification firm his company used. Routinely. Technically within the bounds of the law, morally filthy in the way only wealthy people manage to make legal things feel, and found a survivor benefit clearance level attached to my name that he didn't recognize and couldn't place in any database he had access to. He assumed, because he had never once in 6 years of marriage into this family bothered to ask me a real question about my life, that I'd invented the whole thing. A fake intelligence career, dressed up with government forms and a fancy title, to hide an embarrassing medical discharge I was too proud to admit to. "She's been lying to your father for 14 years, he told Giselle that night, according to text messages. Federal investigators later pulled off both their phones. Think about what that footage would do for the show. Think about what Maison Solerne would pay for a moment like that." Giselle's producers had already floated 3 other rescue segments that quarter: a cooking special with a disgraced celebrity chef, a home renovation reveal for a minor reality star, a tearful reunion segment that had tested poorly with focus groups because, according to the notes I later read in the case file, audiences found the subjects too likable to be interesting. None of it had moved the needle. The show's executive producer, a woman named Renata Ashford, who had spent 11 years building the Belmont Atelier into a syndication asset, had told Giselle in a closed-door meeting that if the numbers didn't turn by the end of the quarter, Maison Solerne would walk, and 3 smaller sponsors would likely follow them out the door within the month. Giselle had cried in that meeting, according to Ashford's own later statement to investigators, and then dried her eyes and gone straight to her husband's office instead of her father's, because some instinct in her, even then, must have known which of the 2 men in her life would actually offer her a solution instead of a lecture. Alistair had listened to her that evening over a dinner neither of them finished, according to the same text thread investigators later reconstructed, and instead of comforting her, he'd asked a single question. What if the story wasn't about the show at all? What if it was about your sister? Giselle had apparently laughed at first, according to her own message back to him. Something about how boring my life would look on camera compared to hers. Alistair's reply, time-stamped at 9:14 that same night, was the one investigators would later read aloud in a pretrial hearing. I wasn't permitted to attend, but heard about from Devereaux afterward. Boring people don't get federal pensions and classified clearances at 34. Trust me, there's a story there. We just have to be the ones who tell it first. Giselle didn't hesitate. I know that now, from a transcript. I didn't know it then. All I knew, lying in a bed that still smelled faintly of a childhood I'd left behind at 17, was that something in the pressure of that apartment had shifted overnight, the specific static charge in the air before a storm nobody's bothered to forecast. I'd spent a decade learning to read that shift in strangers on 3 different continents. I just hadn't expected, not really, to need the skill inside my own family. 9 days after that dinner, Giselle found me herself, in person, at the Wickham Hollow Charity Polo Classic out in Southampton, a benefit my father's foundation had sponsored for 11 consecutive years and that I only attended out of the same quiet family obligation that had gotten me to that dinner table in the first place. I was standing at the rail near the third chukker, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand, when Giselle appeared at my elbow in a wide-brimmed hat and a sundress that had almost certainly been chosen by a stylist for exactly this kind of candid photograph, her voice warm in a register I hadn't heard from her since we were children sharing one bathroom, and, occasionally, one secret. "There's something I want to do," she said, looping her arm through mine like the last 2 weeks hadn't happened at all, guiding me a few steps, away from the crowd near the rail. A live segment on the show, an Elite Veterans Day homecoming tribute. "I want you there, Jax. I've been thinking about how unfair it's been, how little credit you've gotten for everything you've actually done. I want to fix that, on camera, in front of everyone." I let her arm stay looped through mine, and every instinct honed across a decade of counterintelligence work fired at once, quietly, almost gently, the way a well-trained system flags an anomaly instead of screaming about it. The pitch of her voice had risen roughly 4% higher on the word tribute than it had on anything else in the sentence. She'd used the nickname only our mother, and a handful of soldiers had ever earned the right to use, a detail she hadn't bothered with in years. Her smile held for exactly the length of a photograph, then relaxed a fraction too quickly the second she thought I wasn't looking directly at her face, which told me, more than anything else she'd said, that this had been rehearsed, possibly more than once, possibly with someone standing just off camera feeding her the lines. I said yes anyway, sweetly, the way you say yes to a source you already suspect is compromised, because saying no only tells them you've noticed, and noticing early is the entire advantage. Giselle squeezed my arm, delighted, already scanning the crowd for someone worth telling, and I finished my iced tea and left before the 4th chukker, driving back into the city with both hands steady on the wheel and my mind already 3 steps ahead of whatever she thought she'd just arranged. I called the one person in my adult life who had never once needed me to explain or defend myself to him the moment I walked through my own front door. Special Agent Christian Devereaux had been my mother's closest colleague on that joint task force she never talked about at home, back before either Giselle or I understood what joint task force even meant. Back when we thought Mom's strange hours were just what happened to women who worked too hard. He was 46 now, a senior chief in the FBI's counterintelligence division, out of the New York field office, built like a man who had spent 30 years being underestimated by people in much more expensive suits than his own. He'd walked me to my mother's funeral in dress blues 8 years ago, hadn't said a single word the entire drive out to the cemetery. And it had been exactly, precisely what I needed from him that day. He and my mother had run a joint counterintelligence operation together decades earlier, back when Devereaux was still a young field agent fresh out of Quantico, and Eleanor Belmont was the only civilian analyst in the room anyone actually listened to. I'd heard fragments of the story over the years, never the whole thing. A safe house outside Munich, a source who nearly got both of them killed, a friendship that survived whatever happened in that safe house well enough. That Devereaux still called my mother the smartest person I ever worked a case with at her funeral, loud enough for my father to hear it and flinch. My father had never liked Devereaux. I think because Devereaux represented a part of my mother's life he'd never once been permitted inside. And some small, ungenerous part of me has always suspected that was exactly why she'd loved that part of her life so much. "Jax," he said when he picked up on the second ring, using the name only my late mother and a small handful of soldiers had ever earned the right to call me. "What's wrong?" Not a question. He'd known my voice too well, for too long, for it to come out as one. I told him about the polo match, about the tribute segment, about the strange, rehearsed warmth in Giselle's call. I told him about Alistair's sudden, unexplained interest in my pension file, which I'd only just learned about through a records access alert. My old unit still quietly monitored on my behalf. A courtesy extended to a small number of retired officers whose files carried certain flags. Devereaux went silent for 11 full seconds on the line. I counted, out of a habit I've never managed to break, and then he said something that rearranged the entire architecture of my week. "Kingsgrave's under active federal surveillance," he said, his voice dropping into the flat, careful register he used for anything he shouldn't technically be telling me at all. "Has been for 4 months. Transnational financial laundering, possible corporate espionage tied to logistics data, leaving the country through a media company's server infrastructure. I can't say more than that over an open line, and you didn't hear it from me. But Jacqueline, if your sister's married to that man, and he's suddenly interested in your clearance level, you need to think very carefully about what he's planning to do with you in front of a camera." I stood at the kitchen window overlooking Central Park, watching a slow line of joggers move through a golden, ordinary late morning light, and I understood, with the particular clarity that only ever arrives in the middle of real danger, that my sister was about to walk our entire family name straight into a federal furnace, and she had absolutely no idea she was holding the match herself. I could have refused the interview. 6 months earlier, I might have. But something in Devereaux's voice told me this wasn't about protecting my own dignity anymore. Not really. If Alistair was planning to detonate something on live national television, I wanted to be standing exactly where the blast would happen, watching it in real time, not reading about it 3 days later in a headline that got my rank wrong and my career backward. "I'll do the tribute," I told Devereaux. "Jacqueline, I need you watching," I said, not stopping it yet, watching. "Let me see how far she's willing to go before you move." He was quiet again for a moment, and then, because he'd loved my mother's stubbornness enough to have spent 3 decades quietly tolerating mine, he exhaled and said, "I'll have eyes on Kingsgrave's financials by Friday. Call me the second anything on that stage feels wrong." Hung up, and for the first time since that dinner at Park Crescent, the countdown running underneath my ribs stopped feeling like dread and started, very deliberately, to feel like a plan. I spent the 9 days that followed the way I used to spend the 9 days before a deployment, methodically, without wasted motion. I ran the shoreline path along the East River every morning at 5:30, pushing my shoulder past the point of comfort because pain, at least, was a variable I understood how to manage. I met Devereaux once more in person, in the back booth of a diner in Astoria neither of us had ever set foot in before, and would likely never visit again, where he slid a manila folder across the table and told me, in the flattest voice I'd ever heard him use, that the surveillance on Alistair now included financial ties to at least 2 entities the Treasury Department had sanctioned the previous year. I didn't ask how he'd gotten the folder to me outside official channels. Some questions, in this line of work, are better left where they land. I also, on the 6th night, sat down and wrote Giselle a letter I never sent. I don't know, even now, exactly what I intended to do with it. Maybe leave it for her to find after everything was over, maybe never let her see it at all. I wrote about the thunderstorms in Alexandria, about her hand, finding mine in the dark of that bottom bunk, about the version of her I still, against every piece of evidence accumulating in Devereaux's folder, hoped might still exist somewhere underneath the Cartier and the cue cards. I folded the letter into the same drawer where I kept my mother's watch box, and I told myself I'd decide what to do with it once I knew how the broadcast actually went. The broadcast went live 9 days later from a studio on the 41st floor of the Cambrian Tower in Midtown, a glass-walled set dressed to look like a drawing room no actual human being had ever relaxed in. Velvet furniture arranged for camera angles instead of comfort, a fireplace that ran on gas and existed purely for the shot. Vantage Point Studios ran the Belmont Atelier out of that floor 5 days a week, and that Thursday, according to the production assistant who briefed me backstage, while clipping a microphone pack to the inside of my jacket, the segment was tracking toward 4.3 million live viewers, the largest audience the show had pulled in 18 months. Backstage, 20 minutes before the segment, a production assistant named Delaney had knelt in front of me with a powder brush, trying gently to cover the faint scar tissue visible at my collarbone where the silk pantsuit's neckline sat too low, and I'd caught her hand mid-motion, told her to leave it exactly as it was. She'd looked confused, glanced toward Giselle's dressing room down the hall, and said nothing more. I don't think she understood. Not then, that I wanted every scar visible under those lights. I wanted the cameras to have to look directly at what 14 years of service had actually cost, instead of letting a stylist smooth it into something more palatable for a Thursday afternoon audience. I wore a bespoke silk pantsuit the network stylist had chosen for me without asking. My hair pulled back the exact way it had been pulled back under a beret for 14 years, and I sat across from my sister under lights, hot enough to make the studio smell faintly of scorched dust and hairspray. For the first 11 minutes, the segment played almost exactly like Giselle had promised on the phone. She asked soft, well-rehearsed questions about service and sacrifice, the kind designed to make an audience feel patriotic without actually learning anything specific. "What was the hardest part of coming home?" she asked, tilting her head at the exact angle her producers had clearly coached for warmth. And I gave her an answer about silence, about how a quiet apartment feels louder than a war zone for the first few months. An answer that was true enough to satisfy the studio audience, without giving away anything Dara would have flagged as a security concern. She asked about my scars, gesturing vaguely toward my shoulder, and I told her only that they were souvenirs from a job I couldn't fully discuss, which drew a small, sympathetic murmur from the audience that I could feel Giselle enjoying a little too much, like she was already imagining the clip going out on social media with a caption about her brave, wounded sister. I gave soft, careful answers, the kind you give when you already know, somewhere in the part of your brain that never fully stands down, that the floor is about to open beneath you. Then Giselle set down her cue cards with a small, deliberate click against the glass coffee table between us. And something shifted in her posture, the way a stage set shifts when the lighting board changes color without warning. "Actually," she said, smiling now at the primary camera instead of at me, a smile I recognized from 100 childhood photographs of her performing for our father's approval. "I think it's time we talked about what my sister's career really is." The two enormous screens behind her lit up with documents I recognized immediately as heavily doctored excerpts pulled from records that had been sealed for very specific, very legal reasons. My official cover designation, the administrative classification visible to anyone without the clearance to see past it. Standard practice for roughly half of Army counterintelligence personnel, filled the screen in stark black text. Giselle read it aloud like she'd personally uncovered a great fraud after years of dogged investigation. "An administrative clerk," she said, letting the word hang in the studio air, drawing it out until it curdled. "For 14 years, my sister has let this entire family, and now this entire country, believe she was some kind of intelligence officer, when the actual truth is she filed paperwork in an office building in Virginia." The studio audience, 140 of my sister's Manhattan elite, women in 5-figure dresses who had never once spent a night sleeping upright in a vest, men who'd never had to learn what a stairwell in Geneva sounds like, right before it isn't safe anymore, let out a ripple of laughter that wasn't quite laughter, more like the specific sound money makes when it senses weakness in a room and wants to be seen enjoying it. Somewhere off camera, a producer's monitor was scrolling a live comment feed, and I could see it reflected faintly in the black glass of a standby screen to my left. Strangers by the thousands calling me a fraud, a parasite, a grifter who'd been milking a family name I hadn't touched voluntarily in 14 years. Somewhere in that first wave of laughter, I found myself thinking oddly of a training exercise from years earlier, a mock interrogation designed to test how long a candidate could hold a cover story under manufactured social pressure. I'd been the only one in my class to hold the full 90 minutes without a single tell. My instructor had written in the after-action report I still had a copy of somewhere in a storage unit in Alexandria that I possessed an unusually high tolerance for public humiliation in service of the mission. I hadn't understood at the time that the skill would ever be useful outside a training compound. Sitting in that studio chair with my sister's manufactured outrage playing to a live audience, I understood it completely. I sat perfectly still under those lights, my spine straight in the exact way it had been trained to be straight. Since I was 22 years old, and still learning what stillness could cost a person, and I felt something settle into my chest that wasn't panic at all. It was colder than panic. It was the specific stillness that arrives right before you decide, with total clarity, exactly how much damage you're willing to do and to whom. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice to defend a set of documents I understood, better than anyone else in that entire building, had been deliberately stripped of every scrap of context that would have explained them. I looked directly into the lens of the primary camera, not at Giselle, not at the audience murmuring behind the lights, but straight down the black barrel of the one piece of equipment I knew was carrying my face into 4.3 million living rooms at that exact moment. And I let 5 full seconds of silence do more work than any denial ever could have. "Some secrets are classified to protect the mission, Giselle," I said, my voice low enough that the studio had to physically lean in to catch it, which was precisely the effect I wanted. Others are classified to protect the people who'd fall apart the moment they learned the truth. I let that land for a beat, watching it register somewhere behind her eyes. I'd suggest you turn the cameras off while you still have a career left worth protecting. Giselle laughed, bright and theatrical, performing for the room instead of actually hearing what I'd said. That's cute, she said, waving a producer forward with 2 fingers to push the secondary camera in tighter, close enough to catch every micro-expression she'd apparently been coached to expect would crack under pressure. Sweetie, I think the truth is, you don't have anything left to threaten anyone with. A few rows back, I watched an older man in a bow tie lean toward his wife and whisper something behind his program. And though I couldn't hear the words, I could read the shape of his mouth well enough to catch, cold and unbothered, said with a note of genuine confusion, as though my calm had short-circuited the exact reaction the segment had been built to provoke. That confusion, small as it was, told me more than any applause could have. The room had been primed to watch me break. It didn't yet know what to do with a woman who simply wouldn't. I want to tell you something here, because I think it matters more than almost anything else that happened that afternoon. If you caught my last story on this channel, the one about the retired colonel who quietly dismantled his own country club's entire board over a stolen scholarship fund without ever once raising his voice, you already know I believe patience is the sharpest weapon a person can carry into a room full of people who've mistaken volume for power. Stay with me here, because somewhere between minutes 45 and 55 of this video, you're going to watch mine deployed in full. And I promise you, it is absolutely worth the wait. If you want a preview of exactly where this story ends up, there's a card waiting in the corner of your screen right now. Giselle didn't know it yet, and wouldn't know it for another 2 full days. But she had just made the single worst tactical error of her entire career. She had let a trained counterintelligence officer sit under hot studio lights, humiliated in front of millions of strangers, with absolutely nothing left to lose, and a full 90 minutes of studio downtime still ahead of her that same night. The segment wrapped 4 minutes later with a hard cut to commercial, the host across the desk from Giselle stepping in smoothly to promise viewers more on this developing family story after the break. A line I recognized immediately as one that hadn't been in any rundown I'd seen beforehand. The moment the red light above the primary camera clicked off, the studio erupted into a strange, brittle applause, the kind reserved for spectacle rather than substance, and I sat in my chair a moment longer than necessary, letting the last of the adrenaline drain out through my hands before I trusted myself to stand. Backstage, in the VIP green room, down a carpeted hallway I could hear through 2 closed doors, Giselle and Alistair toasted each other with a bottle of vintage crystal a producer had chilled that morning, in case the numbers came in big. According to a runner I overheard talking about it later, the numbers had come in enormous. The segment was already trending on 3 platforms before the broadcast had even finished airing on the East Coast. The stalled syndication call with Maison Solerne, rescheduled for the following Monday morning. My sister's face lit up in the reflection of a monitor with the particular euphoria of someone who had just mistaken cruelty for triumph and hadn't yet learned the difference. Delaney, the production assistant who'd knelt in front of me with a powder brush an hour earlier, found me in the hallway on my way to that smaller dressing room and pressed a paper cup of water into my hand. Without saying a word, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that told me she, at least, hadn't enjoyed the segment either. It was such a small gesture, and it undid something in my chest more thoroughly than an hour of studio cruelty had managed to. I thanked her, and she nodded once, and walked quickly back toward the control room before either of us had to find more words for it. I sat alone in a smaller dressing room 3 doors down, my jacket off, the shrapnel scars along my shoulder visible in the mirror for the first time, in front of anyone but a surgeon and a physical therapist, and I opened a secure, encrypted terminal I'd carried in a false bottom section of my garment bag since Geneva, the kind of equipment I wasn't technically supposed to still have access to, but had never returned, out of a habit that suddenly felt less like negligence and more like foresight. Devereaux had cleared me a narrow temporary federal audit window 2 days earlier, enough legal room to run a forensic pass on any entity directly, connected to an active investigation, provided I flagged everything I found through proper channels and touched absolutely nothing beyond viewing access. It took 40 minutes, working quietly, with the door locked, and a chair braced under the handle out of pure old habit. The terminal booted through 3 separate authentication layers, a process I'd once found tedious and now found, sitting alone in a rented dressing room at 7:52 that evening, almost comforting in its familiarity. A small, controlled ritual in a day that had otherwise handed me nothing controlled at all. Belmont Atelier Media LLC, the production company behind my sister's show, maintained 3 offshore accounts I'd never once heard mentioned in any family conversation, all routed through the same Cayman Island shell I'd already heard Devereaux name, Corvexa Trading Limited. Between the previous March and the week of that broadcast, Corvexa had wired Alistair's firm a cumulative $5,486,217 spread across 11 separate transfers, none of them attached to a single legitimate advisory contract anywhere in the public filing record I could access. I sat with that number for a long moment, feeling something colder than anger settle slowly into the base of my spine, spreading out the way cold water spreads through a shirt. This wasn't a man skimming quietly from his wife's production budget for personal enrichment. This was infrastructure. Somebody had built this pipeline to last. I pulled up the transfer dates one at a time and laid them alongside a decant file, a shipping manifest database I still had limited legal access to, through a professional courtesy extended to retired counterintelligence officers working with active federal cases. 8 of the 11 transfers landed within 48 hours of specific cargo vessels clearing customs at ports in Newark, Norfolk, and Long Beach. Vessels carrying components the Department of Defense classified under a restricted export schedule. I didn't need Devereaux to explain what that pattern meant. I'd built pattern recognition models almost exactly like it, for almost exactly this purpose, in a windowless office in Fort Belvoir years earlier. Watching one built against my own family using infrastructure my own sister had personally authorized was a different kind of exercise entirely. By the time I finished cross-referencing the wire dates against Corvexa's registered directors, a chain that dead-ended, predictably and almost elegantly, in a numbered account with no listed human being attached to it anywhere, I understood something that made the studio humiliation an hour earlier feel almost small by comparison. A childhood grievance next to something with actual teeth. My sister hadn't just married badly, the way people say when they mean someone chose a difficult spouse. She had built her entire public platform, whether she understood it or not, directly on top of a pipeline she should have questioned the very first time a payment cleared into the company's accounts without a single invoice attached to justify it. What the forensic trail showed next made my hands go completely still over the keyboard, the way they used to go still in the field right before something happened that couldn't be undone. Alistair hadn't only been laundering money through Corvexa, he had also been quietly using the show's own satellite uplink infrastructure, the same high-bandwidth broadcast bridge that carried the Belmont Atelier into 41 countries every single week, to route encrypted data packets to servers registered well outside U.S. jurisdiction. I recognized the transmission pattern immediately, the way you recognize a signature you've spent years being trained specifically to catch. It wasn't advertising metadata, buried harmlessly in the noise of a fashion segment. It was restricted logistics information, shipping manifests, port clearance schedules, cargo routing data belonging to companies holding active federal defense contracts, smuggled inside compression files, attached to segments about handbags and vacation homes, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent a decade being paid specifically to notice exactly this kind of thing. I sat back from the terminal for a moment, my hands finally still, and let myself feel the specific vertigo of realizing my own family's business had, quite literally, been carrying national security data out of the country every single week, disguised as a segment about which handbag to buy for fall. Somewhere in those 41 countries, on the other end of an uplink my sister had personally approved the budget for, someone was almost certainly being paid a great deal of money for information that would never, not once, show up on any invoice Giselle would ever see. I thought about the shipping manifests specifically, companies with names I recognized, defense subcontractors whose executives had shaken my father's hand at Gallus exactly like the one Devereaux and I were now quietly planning to interrupt. And I understood that this had never really been about a television show at all. It had been about access, dressed up in couture, running through a network my own family had built and trusted without ever once asking what it actually cost. My sister hadn't been the mastermind behind any of it. I want to be honest about that here, because it would have been so much easier, in a strange way, to hate her cleanly and completely. But the equipment authorizations bore her actual signature, in her actual handwriting. The extra satellite time she'd personally approved, the third-party vendors she'd vouched for herself to the network's legal department 18 months earlier, at Alistair's quiet request. All of it traced directly back to decisions Giselle had made with her own hand, chasing ratings and sponsorship money with a recklessness that never once stopped to ask what exactly her husband needed all that extra bandwidth for in the first place. I kept looking for a version of the evidence that would let her off the hook. The way you keep checking a wound you already know is worse than it looks. I told myself for almost 20 minutes that maybe she'd sign those authorizations without reading them, the way people sign things at a closing table without absorbing a word. But the file included an internal email sent from Giselle's own account 11 months earlier, asking Alistair's operations manager why the satellite time request had jumped so much this quarter, a question she'd apparently accepted an answer to without ever following up, without ever asking a second question, because the answer she got let her keep chasing the numbers she actually cared about. She hadn't been blind. She'd been convenient to herself, in the specific way people are convenient to themselves when the truth would cost them something they don't want to give up. She wasn't just a vain sister looking for one viral moment on a slow news week anymore. She was a fully complicit vessel for something that qualified, under federal statute, as both corporate espionage and something considerably darker than either of us had grown up ever imagining our family capable of touching. I sat in that dressing room a long time before I trusted myself to move again, feeling the particular, specific grief of watching someone you've loved your entire life reveal exactly how far they were willing to go for one more headline, one more sponsorship check, one more room full of people applauding. I packaged everything I'd found: the decrypted wire records, the satellite transmission logs, Giselle's own signed equipment authorizations, a timeline cross-referenced carefully against Alistair's known travel over the previous 18 months, into a single encrypted file, and transmitted it directly to Devereaux's secure channel at 11:52 that night, my thumb hovering over the send command for exactly as long as it took to remember that hesitation at this point would only cost more people more damage later. His reply came back 4 minutes later, 3 words: "Nothing more. Received. Stand by." I didn't sleep that night. I sat alone in my old childhood bedroom with the lights off, turning my mother's watch over and over in my hands, running my thumb slowly across the 6 words engraved into the caseback that I still hadn't told a single person about, and I understood, with a calm that surprised even me, that whatever came next, there was no version of this family that survived it fully intact. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I wasn't as afraid of that as I probably should have been. The 2 days that followed moved with the strange, suspended quality of the last hours before any operation goes live. Devereaux called once, briefly, to confirm that the arrest warrants had cleared a federal magistrate and that his team would need a controlled environment with predictable exits, which was how I learned, almost as an afterthought, that my father had already announced the Aurelia Grace Gala to celebrate the Maison Solerne signing, and that the guest list, the timing, and the isolation of a boat anchored offshore made it, in Devereaux's clinical assessment, operationally ideal. I remember feeling a strange, unwelcome pang of guilt at that phrase, at the idea that my father's vanity had just handed federal law enforcement the perfect stage for his own daughter's arrest, and then remembering, just as quickly, that he'd built that stage entirely on his own, guest list and string quartet and all. 3 nights later, my father hosted a private gala aboard his 180-foot super yacht, the Aurelia Grace, anchored off the Hudson River piers to celebrate the newly finalized Maison Solerne syndication deal. $42 million, 3 years. Terms signed that very same afternoon in a conference room I hadn't been invited anywhere near. He'd invited 200 guests that night. Corporate sponsors in from 3 continents, a handful of city council members, a state senator who owed him an old favor from a shipping contract, signed a decade earlier and never quite forgotten. Waitstaff moved silently through the deck, carrying trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than most of the crew serving it made in an entire week of work. A jazz quartet had been replaced for the evening with a full-string ensemble. My father had flown in from a private conservatory in Boston, and somewhere near the helipad, a photographer from a business magazine was already lining up shots of the guest list, for a feature my father had personally lobbied to secure. I'd overheard him earlier that week on the phone with his publicist, discussing the headline he wanted, something about legacy, about a family that had weathered scandal and come out stronger, a story he fully intended to tell, regardless of whether it was true. I stood near a coil of docking rope at the stern, watching 200 people who had no idea they were standing on a stage set for something none of them had been told about, and I found myself, for one strange moment, almost sorry for the string quartet. I wore my dress uniform. Not the pantsuit, not the silk, not anything my sister's stylist would ever have chosen for me. The actual dress uniform, pressed and precise. A bronze star pinned exactly where regulation required it to sit, half an inch above the left breast pocket. A woman I didn't recognize, one of my father's business partner's wives, complimented the uniform in passing, asked brightly if it was a costume for the evening. And I told her, just as brightly, that it wasn't, and watched her decide not to ask a follow-up question. I stayed deliberately away from the noise and the crowd after that, and watched my father climb a small raised platform near the bow to raise his toast to the string quartet's opening notes. "To my daughter Giselle," he said, his voice carrying easily and warmly across 200 rapt, well-dressed faces. "For her brave investigative journalism this week, for having the sheer courage to purge this family of its liabilities in front of the entire country, live on national television." He gestured, without quite looking directly at me, toward the shadowed back edge of the deck where I was standing. I think we've all learned a great deal this week about the difference between real accomplishment and a costume people wear because they've got nothing else to show for themselves. The crowd laughed, politely, the specific laughter of people who understood exactly what was being asked of them and were happy to provide it in exchange for another glass of champagne. Somewhere near the bar, I caught Alistair's eye across the deck. He raised his glass toward me with a small, deeply satisfied smile, the smile of a man who genuinely believed, right up until the very last minute of his freedom, that he had already won something enormous and permanent. Giselle didn't look at me at all. She was busy accepting a stream of congratulations from a Mie Solern executive. I recognized from the contract paperwork. Devereaux's team had pulled 2 days earlier. I checked my watch, my mother's watch, the one nobody on that deck had ever bothered to look at closely enough to recognize, and noted the time without letting my expression change. 9:41 p.m. Devereaux's team would already be in position offshore, holding for the signal I hadn't yet sent. I let myself have one more minute of ordinary stillness at that rail, watching the lights of the city smear gently across the black water, before I reached for the transmitter. I reached into the interior pocket of my uniform jacket and pressed a single button on a small transmitter. Devereaux had handed me 2 nights earlier in a parking garage on West 44th Street, a device no larger than a hotel keycard. It sent exactly one signal, nothing more, confirmation of physical presence, ready to proceed on his mark. Then I waited, calm in a way that genuinely surprised even me, for the specific sound of rotors cutting across open water. It came 11 minutes later, tearing straight through the string quartet's second movement, drowning out the polite applause that was still trailing off after my father's toast. 2 matte black FBI tactical helicopters descended low and fast over the Aurelia Grace, their spotlights sweeping the deck in wide, deliberate arcs of red and blue that turned 200 designer gowns and tailored tuxedos into something that looked, in that instant, closer to a crime scene than a celebration. The band stopped mid-phrase, the cellist's bow still hovering an inch above the strings. Somewhere near the bow, a champagne flute shattered against the teak decking, the sound sharp and small under the roar of the rotors. 200 guests scattered across the deck in a controlled panic, evening gowns catching on deck cleats. A state senator, ducking behind an ice sculpture shaped like the Belmont family crest, as though it might actually stop a federal agent. My father stood frozen near the bow, one hand still raised mid-tast, his champagne glass tipping slowly in his grip until it finally slipped and shattered against the deck, the sound swallowed almost entirely by the rotors. I watched the exact moment he understood, in real time, that whatever headline his publicist had been planning for that Boston Conservatory string quartet and that magazine photographer was never going to run. Federal agents in full tactical gear rappelled down onto the bow in a controlled practice sequence. I recognized instantly from a dozen briefings I'd once helped design in a different life, and Special Agent Christian Devereaux stepped forward through the center of them with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had been planning this exact moment for 4 straight months, and had no intention of rushing the last 30 seconds of it. He didn't shout, he never needed to. His voice carried clean and level across the wind and the rising panic on deck. "Alistair Kingsgrave," he said, "you're under arrest for corporate espionage, wire fraud, and violation of federal export control statutes." 2 agents moved in on either side of Alistair before he'd fully processed the sentence, his champagne glass still balanced absurdly in one hand when the cuffs closed around his wrists. Giselle screamed then, a real scream, raw and unrehearsed, the first genuinely unperformed sound I'd heard out of my sister in longer than I could remember. As a second team of agents moved toward her near the stage. "I didn't know," she kept saying, over and over, to agents who weren't listening, and to a father who had gone the color of old paper somewhere behind her. "I didn't know what he was doing with the servers. I swear to God, I didn't know." The 200 guests who'd been laughing at my father's toast 20 minutes earlier now stood pressed against the far railing in silent clusters, phones raised, none of them quite brave enough to look away. I recognized the Maison Solerne executive who'd been congratulating Giselle near the bar. He was already on his own phone, walking briskly toward the gangway, and I understood, watching him go, that the $42 million deal had died sometime in the last 90 seconds, somewhere between the first helicopter and the first pair of handcuffs. A woman near me I didn't recognize whispered to her husband, loud enough to carry, "I always thought that show felt a little too perfect." And I thought, with a tiredness that went all the way down to the bone, that everyone standing on that deck had always known something was wrong and simply hadn't cared enough until it became a spectacle worth caring about. I stood at the stern in my dress uniform, my bronze star catching the sweep of a passing spotlight, and watched my sister get read her rights on someone's live cell phone video that would be circulating online within the hour, and I felt none of the satisfaction I had, somewhere in the back of my mind, once quietly imagined I might feel. Mostly what I felt was tired. The particular, bone-deep tired that arrives after an operation ends, and you finally let yourself understand that the cost was never, at any point, going to be optional. Devereux found me a few minutes later, once his team had secured the deck, and a second boat had arrived to ferry Alistair and Giselle back toward a federal processing facility in Lower Manhattan. He didn't say anything about the arrest, didn't offer the kind of hollow congratulations I think he understood I had no use for. He just stood beside me at the rail for a while, watching the harbor lights, and finally said, "Your mother would have hated this part, the waiting around part, after it's already done." I told him I understood exactly what he meant, because I did. She'd always said the hardest part of the job was never the operation itself. It was standing in the wreckage afterward, watching people you couldn't save finally understand what they'd lost. Somewhere behind us, crew members were already moving through the deck collecting abandoned champagne flutes and folding chairs, the ordinary, unglamorous cleanup that follows every disaster regardless of how much money was spent on the evening beforehand. I watched one of the waitstaff, a young man who couldn't have been older than 20, sweep broken glass into a dustpan with the same careful, unhurried motion he'd probably used all night, and I thought about how much of the world simply keeps working, quietly, underneath whatever spectacle the people with money happen to be making of themselves. By morning, the federal whistleblower file I had assembled 2 nights earlier went fully public through the Justice Department's press office, laid out in exacting, methodical, almost clinical detail across every major outlet by sunrise. The Corvexa wire transfers, the satellite data pipeline, and a detail I hadn't even known about myself until Devereux's team finished their own parallel audit, a set of forged estate documents Giselle had quietly filed 18 months earlier in an attempt to redirect what remained of our mother's trust entirely into her own name. Maison Solerne pulled its $42 million syndication deal by 9 that morning, releasing a 2-line statement about irreconcilable brand risk that ran on every business page in the country. 3 other sponsors followed by noon. By that evening, the Belmont Atelier had been quietly pulled from every affiliate that had ever carried it, the show's own website replaced with a single holding page. My father found me on the yacht's lower deck an hour after the agents had gone, sitting alone in a chair someone had knocked sideways during the chaos and never bothered to write. He looked, in the gray early light coming off the water, genuinely old. For the very first time in my entire adult life, the confidence gone out of his shoulders like air out of something punctured. "You did this," he said. Not quite a question, not quite an accusation either. Something closer to disbelief, like he was still waiting, even now, for the version of the story where I turned out to be the villain after all. "No," I said, standing slowly, my bronze star catching the last of the dock lights strung along the pier. "Alistair did this. Giselle let it happen because she never once thought to question where his money was actually coming from, as long as it kept arriving. I just made sure none of it stayed buried the way they were counting on it to stay." I unpinned the bronze star from my chest and set it down carefully on the small table beside him, next to an untouched glass of champagne someone had abandoned hours earlier. "My career was never fake, Father," I said, my voice steady enough to carry easily across the empty deck in the pre-dawn quiet. Your daughter's integrity was. I built mine on a stairwell in Geneva, bleeding out for a country that will never even know my name. You built yours on a live broadcast, and a company you never once bothered to ask a single hard question about, because the numbers kept coming in the way you wanted them to. He didn't answer. I don't think, in that moment, he had an answer left anywhere inside him. I walked down the gangway alone, past the flashing lights of 2 federal vehicles still parked along the pier, past a small cluster of reporters who didn't yet know who I was and wouldn't for another few hours, until a Rolls-Royce I'd arranged that morning, through a car service I'd used exactly once before pulled up to take me home, to an apartment that had absolutely nothing to do with any of them. I sat in the back seat as the city started to wake up around us, and finally took my mother's watch out of my jacket pocket, turning it over one last time to read the 6 words she'd had engraved into the case back the year before she died. The words I'd carried through Geneva and through every quiet, humiliating dinner at Park Crescent since. Duty is quiet. Wear it well. I understood finally, sitting alone in the dark with the city sliding past the window, exactly why she'd left that watch with me instead of my sister. Giselle had spent her whole life chasing rooms that would applaud her, building an entire identity out of being seen, being watched, being talked about. I had spent mine, most of it anyway, in rooms where no one would ever know my name at all, doing work that would never once appear on a resume or a headline. And I'd learned, the hard way, in a stairwell in Geneva and in 100 quieter moments before it, that the second kind of life leaves you steadier when the applause you never had eventually turns into something uglier. I hadn't handed that watch over at dinner because it was never really about a piece of jewelry, however beautiful, however valuable at auction. It was about the one single thing in that entire family that nobody could manufacture, purchase, or fake convincingly enough for a camera, and I wasn't going to let anyone talk me into trading it for their approval, not even my own father, not even for one peaceful evening. The city kept moving past the window, delivery trucks and early commuters and a garbage crew working a corner near Sutton Place, and I thought about the ambush in Geneva for the first time in weeks without flinching away from it. I'd gone down in that stairwell believing, for about 90 seconds, that I wasn't going to walk back out of it, and the thought that had steadied me then hadn't been my father's approval or my sister's applause or anything resembling a headline. It had been my mother's voice, oddly, the specific tone she used when she was correcting a mistake, in my homework without making me feel small for having made it. Duty is quiet. I hadn't fully understood, kneeling in that stairwell with my hand pressed against my own shoulder, that she'd been preparing me for a very different kind of ambush all along. One with far better lighting, a live studio audience, and a sister holding the knife instead of a stranger. The fallout didn't stop with the show. Within a week, 2 of Belmont Maritime Holdings' long-standing corporate partners quietly let their shipping contracts lapse, rather than renew them under a company name now attached, however unfairly, to a federal espionage case. A gossip column that had spent a decade fawning over my father's charitable galas ran a piece instead about the unraveling of a Manhattan dynasty, and I heard, secondhand, that the state senator who'd owed my father a favor stopped returning his calls entirely. My father had spent 30 years building a name that opened doors on reputation alone, and it took less than a month for that same name to start closing them instead, one quiet, well-mannered rejection at a time. I didn't take any satisfaction in that either. I'd simply stopped expecting to feel much of anything about my father's business by then. I called my father exactly once in the 2 weeks that followed, not because I owed him the conversation, but because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to give him the chance to say something worth hearing. He didn't take the call the first time. When he finally did, 4 days later, he asked only one question: whether I'd known, before that dinner at Park Crescent, that any of this was coming. I told him the truth, that I hadn't known the specifics, only that something in the room had felt wrong, long before I had the evidence to prove it. He was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line, and then he said, in a voice I'd never once heard him use in 34 years, that he was sorry, not for the watch, not for the dinner, for 14 years of assuming that the daughter who came home quietly must have less to show for herself than the one who never stopped talking. I don't know if I believe he meant it yet. I don't know if it matters in the end, whether he did. Giselle is out on bond as I record this, awaiting trial on charges that carry, if she's convicted on all counts, a minimum of 6 years. Devereaux told me, in the flat, careful way he tells me anything he's not technically supposed to, that she'd stopped fighting the evidence 3 weeks into her own attorney's review and started talking instead. quietly, at length, about the satellite authorizations, about the question she'd asked Alistair's operations manager and never followed up on, about every convenient assumption she'd let herself make, because the alternative would have cost her something she wasn't ready to give up. It wasn't an apology. Nobody had asked her for one. But it was, Devereaux said, the first honest accounting anyone in that family had heard out of her in years. Alistair is being held without bond, cooperating, according to Devereaux, in ways that are already unraveling parts of Corvex's network I hadn't even found in my own audit. Neither of them has called me. I don't expect either of them to. I've started a small consulting practice, out of a 2-room office in Alexandria, not far from where my mother used to catch the shuttle bus to Fort Meade every morning. Devereaux sends me a case now and then, the kind that needs someone who understands both a balance sheet and a battlefield, and I've found, to my own quiet surprise, that I like the work more than I ever expected to like anything that didn't come with a uniform attached to it. I still wear my mother's watch every day. I still haven't sent Giselle the letter, though I haven't thrown it away either. Some things, I've decided, are allowed to stay unfinished for a while. If there's one thing I genuinely want you to take from all of this, it's that the people who mock your quiet aren't always wrong that you're different from them. What they're usually wrong about is what that difference actually means. I spent 14 years being underestimated by people who mistook silence for absence, who assumed that because I didn't perform my dignity out loud, I must not have possessed any at all. And every single time, without exception, it was the silence that ended up doing the work loud voices never could have managed. I don't regret staying quiet at that dinner table the night Giselle asked for my mother's watch. I only regret that it took a federal indictment, 2 helicopters, and my own family's public collapse for the people who raised me, to finally understand what that quiet had been protecting all along. Before you go, if this story pulled at you the way I genuinely hope it did, I've got another one waiting right at the corner of your screen. A story about a mother nobody in her own family thought was paying close enough attention, until the one single day it mattered more than anything else ever had. It's become one of the most watched stories on this entire channel, and I have a feeling you'll understand exactly why the moment you press play.